Well, good day, everybody. We've been talking most recently about the concept of Christian ethics in relationship to Christian theology, which Michael Banner in the book that we're going to start reading now, or we're going to start discussing now, Michael Banner usually uses the word dogmatics. Dogmatics has become a very politically incorrect word these days, because when people hear the word dogmatic, what do they think of? Again, this is the way in which words which generally had a very specific and profound meaning in the past have now come to mean something almost entirely negative. What do people usually mean when they talk about dogmatic?
A closed-minded teaching.
Okay. And in many ways, there is a large there's been a large movement in Western history derived from the Enlightenment, but more specifically derived from modernism, which holds that almost any discussion of religious ethics, particularly Jewish or Christian ethics, should be left out of public discussion, because religious ethics are purely personal, they're purely subjective. And as a result, ethics as a whole has been generally left out of a great deal of modern discussion. And the assumption, I guess, on the part of some people is that you can learn what is right if you just learn what is, or what is democratically viable, or something like that. In other words, you can learn what to do by studying sociology and psychology and so forth. Well, we, I think, are learning how confusing that gets, and how impossible it is once you let any cat out of the bag, or any genie out of the bottle, however you want to put it, such as cloning or any similar issue, that ethics is so far behind in its public discussion that there's no way to actually head off anything that might be ethically destructive. For instance, on the issue of cloning, there evidently are going to be some cloned human beings within the next 2 years. Now, that was not an ethical choice made by the American people. The issue has only begun to be discussed recently after somebody threatened to do this. And interestingly enough, the first clone of a human being is probably going to be done by a very small religious sect called the RELS, who consider themselves to be who consider all human beings to be the descendants of aliens from other planets. And you might consider that the first clone human being in the United States may be cloned by a group of people who have a very specific religious ethic, but it's not related at all to Christianity or to Judaism or to the Judeo-Christian way of thinking or way of doing. I'm not accusing the RELS of being horrible people or anything. All I'm pointing out is that this is a very sectarian religious group, which is non-Christian and to a certain extent anti-Christian, who is basically taken upon itself the right to decide the issue of whether there should be human beings cloned in the United States. And people are beginning to shoot, kind of sniper-like from the grandstands at this, and that we're even going to have more congressional hearings on it. But there used to be a kind of a feeling, even after the Enlightenment. In fact, the Enlightenment itself kind of determined the fact that there was an ethic that you could come to. It was basically a rational ethic. It was basically an ethic that comes out of the rational and philosophical analysis of the human nature and of human condition and so forth. But that preserved for a while some of the basic notions which had come into Western culture through Judaism and Christianity. That preserved that. In other words, Enlightenment ethics it kind of took the place in Western culture of Christian ethics. But that wasn't too jarring an event, since Enlightenment ethics themselves arose out of the people who produced Enlightenment ethics were themselves people whose grandparents were Christians or Jews. And so their ethics, ironically or paradoxically or coincidentally, are very convergent with traditional Christian ethics on most principal subjects. Where non-Christian ethics, based on a non-Christian theology, have had tremendous influence, particularly in the 20th century. For instance, in the influence of Marxism and Leninism, Maoism, the influence of Nazism. These have generally had a much more powerful impact on a society than kind of rational ethics, rational Enlightenment ethics. So that even though Germany, for instance, in the 1920s and 30s, was the most educated and the most cultured and supposedly the most highly civilized, or at least one of the most highly civilized peoples in the world, out of Germany in the 30s came Nazism. How do you explain that? Well, even as Nazism developed, there still remained in Germany a prophetic voice against it. This prophetic voice kept quiet too long, kept silent too long, so that by the time it started speaking out, the practitioners of this voice were themselves put in concentration camps and executed and so forth. And so they didn't have that much effect on the ultimate outcome of the Nazi experiment. The only thing that had a determining effect on the outcome of the Nazi experiment was the outrage of other cultures that had come out of Judeo-Christian thought, such as England and the United States. And it had to be suppressed basically by violence. But even during the Nazi regime, there were little breakthroughs. For instance, the Nazis, based on their own theology, which is basically a European pagan philosophy of blood and soil, based on their own theology, some of their ethical principles which they put into law were, for instance, the extermination of mentally defective persons. Well, there was still enough gumption in traditional Christian ethics in Germany to get that law rescinded. That didn't mean the Nazis quit doing what they wanted to do, but at least they got that law rescinded. But there wasn't still enough gumption in Christian ethics during the Nazi period to actually protect other people from Nazi ethics. So the 20th century is a battlefield of theologies. It's a battlefield of ethics. And so our kind of laissez-faire view of theological and ethical thinking in the United States doesn't portend much good for the future. In other words, people who want to think ethically evidently are not going to have much impact on what happens, either scientifically or politically or any other way, because ethics as well as theology have been relegated to a totally personal, totally subjective situation. We're not supposed to, quote, wear our religion on our sleeve, which means sometimes in our culture we're not even supposed to let anybody know that we are religious, much less that we might have a particular ethical view of something that comes out of that religion. But as Ramsey points out, one of the important things about Christian ethics, and in a related way about Jewish ethics, though Jews have never been a majority in any Western country. Whatever Christian ethics was derived from Judaism has become kind of a majority in various places, even though the ethics of a majority in any culture are usually not a very pure ethic of any kind. But what Ramsey points out is that the ethics that produce things like the English-American conception of democracy, for instance, and the English-American conception of human nature, human rights, civil rights, and so forth, not just the English and American, but a great many European countries, was basically the theology of Puritanism, as it was mediated most directly by Puritan kinds of Christians, such as the Puritans who first came to America, the Dutch Reformed who first came to America, the Dutch Reformed people in Holland, the Puritans in England. And so the rights of man, the rights of citizens, and the extension of citizenship and those rights to a larger number of people arose in our recent history, in our recent world history, out of the impact of Puritanism and other forms of theology and ethics. And so whether or not we want to give any form, ancient or modern, of Puritan theology and Puritan ethics any place in the public sector, we need to at least understand that what kept our kind of theology of human nature and our ethics of human nature alive up until recently was this particular theological and ethical perspective. And part of it is, the first half of it, of course, is that human beings are good because they're made in the image of God. The second part of it is that human beings are sinners. And so all of the philosophers of democracy have made the point that democracy is possible because of the goodness of human beings, the good nature of human beings, but democracy is essential or necessary because of the sinful nature of human beings. If it weren't for the sinful nature of human beings, you would not have to have democratic, you would not have to kind of try to derive democratic consent to allow the expression of human rights. You would not have to, because people would just naturally express them, just like that's the philosophy of anarchism. People would just naturally express the right if you just give them the freedom to. Democracy is different from anarchism in that it assumes that there is something that needs to be restrained in human nature. There need to be checks and balances in human nature. That idea traditionally has come from the Judeo-Christian ethic, and it was not found in the pagan ethics in Europe that preceded Jewish and Christian ethics. That's the reason why it took a great deal of time for any kind of, quote, democratic way of looking at human beings or any kind of public civil rights were recognized very extensively. And by the time they began to be recognized under the impact of Puritanism in England, France, Holland, America, and so forth, these rights also came to be recognized by a kind of a foster child of Jewish Christian ethics, that is the European Enlightenment. But even the European Enlightenment, as you noticed if you read Ramsey, for instance, ethics dependent upon people like Rousseau, the idea of human rights, even in Rousseau, is understood to be something that has to be protected, because no matter how democratic the society, you do not have in any society enough, quote, purity of heart in order for rights to be protected just by some kind of laissez-faire organization of society. Somehow or another, there has to be an organization of society in which sin is restrained. We talked last time, for instance, about the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, and so forth. And at that time, conservatives, right-wing people, argued, well, Martin Luther King does not serve any just purpose because you can't, this is a very pious statement, you can't force ethics on anybody. You can't force goodness on anybody. Meaning, again, that people were thinking, these right-wing people were thinking of ethics in a totally personalistic and subjective form. Well, of course you cannot force anybody to love anybody else. But you can restrain that person from beating up on somebody else. And human rights are not going to exist in any culture where sin is not restrained. And the fact that the restraint of sin is going to have to be restraint on Christians doesn't change that. Because Christian theology has always understood Christians themselves to be sinners. And so George Washington, according to the Puritan ethics of the period, was not good enough, even though he was an extremely good man and everybody thought he was a good man. Some of the Enlightenment type people thought he was such a good man that he could be made into an enlightened despot and have no checks and balances, even be called king. But the Puritans wouldn't allow that. And so as a result, George Washington became president. And it turns out that he was an extremely ethical person. He was probably one of the first people in history to voluntarily give up power. And so what people thought of him is largely justified. He was an extremely good and ethical man. But he, just like the Puritans, understood that no one human being is good enough to govern other human beings. So there has to be some checks and balances, some restraint of sin. Now, that's one of the things we've lost to a certain extent in the last few decades in our understanding of democracy. And so freedom of speech, freedom of expression, human rights, individual rights, in fact, are sometimes approached as if there were no necessity in any circumstances to restrain human sin. Well, we don't want to go back to the kind of restraint perhaps that our Puritan ancestors put on us, because times have changed. What is evil has not become good, but times have changed, and so the way we relate to people and so forth is different. For instance, Christian ethics has produced, since the Puritans, the abolition of slavery. It's produced the abolition of child labor. It's produced worker protection, safety protection. It's produced the women's voter movement, women's liberation movement, and so forth. And so, in a sense, you can't stick or stay at any one point of the working out of ethics or the working out of Christian ethics, because you're never at the eschaton. And so we have seen, since the time of the Puritans, the importance of a different conception of democracy, a different conception of human rights, a different conception of women's rights and workers' rights and so forth. And those are gains that we should not go back on. We've also, and this was also a product of Puritans like John Milton and so forth, we've also managed to create in the United States an incredible space for freedom of speech and freedom of expression and freedom of religion. Theologically, the Puritans, such as Milton and the people that came to America, theologically they were already set for freedom of religion. Practically speaking, sometimes they didn't play that ethic out very well, but it kind of set the stage. So Puritans in the American, among the American founders, such as Madison, and by the way, I need to stop here and tell you, y'all need to keep an eye on me while I'm talking, because last week I kept saying Monroe when I meant Madison. You know, Madison is quoted quite often by Ramsey, because Madison is basically the theological ethicist of the American Revolution. And it's out of Madison in association with Jefferson, who is also considered by modern ethicists to be a theologian, as well as Abraham Lincoln, though they didn't go to theology school and their theology was not necessarily Orthodox Christian. They still had basically an ethical perspective and a theological perspective without which American democracy would not have had its support and freedom for human rights, its freedom for expression, and its separation of church and state. In other words, Madison was in favor of separation of church and state because he was a Christian, not because he was anti-Christian. The purpose of the separation of church and state, which is one of the most important experiments that America has contributed to world history, is not just that it protects the state from the church as it needs to do, but also that it protects religion from the state. You know, both of those things are involved. And that's because people like Jefferson and Madison were the people who were the proponents of these. Interestingly enough, they became proponents of it because of the extreme stubbornness of some Puritans, such as the Baptists, who would not allow the state or the government to interfere with their religious practices or their ethical ideals. And so as a result, and also would not allow the government to interfere with their preaching. And so a lot of the American revolutionaries kind of made their living and made their reputation defending these extremist Puritans. And so in a sense, our concept of the separation of church and state is not as directly related or directly attributable to the Puritans of the type that landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts. It is directly attributable to the Puritans like Roger Williams, who were even more extreme in their religious ideas over in Rhode Island. So the first place probably in the world, the first places probably in the world in which there was really separation of church and state were places like Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, where the Quakers had a great deal of influence. So when Ramsey then, what I'm trying to say is when Ramsey talks about sin, he's not talking about just kind of religious, esoteric religious concept, which has nothing to do with the way we live our lives, even our public lives, our political lives. We may not agree with these doctrines as people like Madison and Jefferson held them, but at least we need to understand historically that we have to have some kind of equivalent doctrines in order to maintain a republic in which sin is restrained and human rights are given some kind of freedom. So remember, when you go back and reread some of this material, that some of these wonderful quotations from Madison, and that they are not from Monroe. It may, of course, Ramsey says, be true that some particular restraining social institution does more harm than good, and Christians have always been among those challenging the given social systems as unjustifiable in major respects. People who call themselves Christians have also always been among those who have participated in these unjust social systems. So I want to always keep that in front of you. This is not an apologetic Christian course, or a course in Christian apologetics. It's a course in which we are simply trying to understand what the nature of Christian ethics and theology is and how it has impacted our modern way of looking at things, both positively and negatively. Although specific forms in coercion may produce specific evils, not all evil is simply a consequence of restraint. In fact, it works the other way around. People need restraint because of the primary fact of sin. Most people who are now in college did not experience or live through the two times in American history when the concept of the restraint of sin was most important in the history of American political thought. One was during the Roosevelt era. There are two ways in which Franklin Roosevelt relates to Christian ethics. The first way is that he was a descendant of Dutch Reformed Christians. And therefore his ethic was basically a Puritan ethic, particularly in respect to the protection of the poor and helping the helpless and protecting the helpless. But another way shows the importance of the Puritan doctrine of sin, even in protecting Americans from Franklin Roosevelt. Because you remember when Franklin Roosevelt did what he considered to be very good things. He promoted what he considered to be very good programs. But the Congress, whether or not they were right or not, objected to those programs, and the Supreme Court of the United States declared some of those programs to be unconstitutional. Well, what was happening was the Puritan conception of a good man trying to do something, but other people having checks and balances, that is, restraining possibly the overzealousness of a good man, were acting perfectly properly. So what did Franklin Roosevelt do? He tried to pack the Supreme Court. In other words, if he didn't have enough people on the Supreme Court to get his good measures through, and historically and ethically speaking, I think most of Roosevelt's programs were ethically good and would have been better for America. But our system made it so that Roosevelt could not make that final decision, because nobody is good enough to make all of the ethical decisions for everybody else. And so there were restraints. But when that restraint showed itself, then Roosevelt tried to pack the Supreme Court. Well, that's when not just rightists, but even liberals had to stand up to Roosevelt. And he was not able to pack the Supreme Court. And so he was not able to get some of the things through that might have been good for America, but at the same time, the Constitution survived. All right, you had a similar thing with Richard Nixon. And what saved the country from Richard Nixon was not some kind of general revulsion against Richard Nixon's attitude. It was a constitutional check and balance that had been instituted because the Puritans and the founders of our country understood that even the best person, the person with the best intentions, is a sinner, and he has to be watched. As one old Puritan would say that of course, this old Puritan was Al Capp, who did Little Abner, which you may not be familiar with, but his theology was about politics was that, of course, all politicians are crooks. That's the reason why they should be elected, so that you can put them in Washington where you can keep an eye on them. Well, of course, that's not a serious ethical principle, but at the same time, it's a recognition that all politicians have the potential or capacity of being corrupt, even though from their perspective they may be perfectly wonderful and perfectly moral, and yet they be working on the basis of self-interest or on the basis of the interests of people who are not working for the interest of the people as a whole. So there have always been situations in which coercion has been corrupted, and that's still true. We still have a difficult problem in the United States, and we will continue to have it probably till all of us are dead and all of our descendants are dead. And that is, you have to keep your eye on the legal system. You have to keep your eye on the law enforcement process. You have to keep your eye on law enforcement officers. Because I know personally law enforcement officers, and they are fine, upstanding individuals. But when you give a law enforcement officer power, he has to make decisions based on his personal insight into a situation quite often. And we can't allow law enforcement and the laws to be primarily executed at the whim of individuals, no matter how good they are. So that's the reason why we will always have what we ordinarily call a broken legal system, broken law enforcement, because there's never going to come a time, no matter what the chief of police says, there's never going to come a time when all enforcement of the law is just. And you can't have peace without justice. And so when justice is not properly enforced, then you have to actually apply more coercion, because peace will be undermined. In the marriage ceremony, before God in this congregation, a person assumes a vow. He promises permanence, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness or in health, till death do us part. His will to permanence constitutes his own inward acknowledgement of what society institutionalizes in the marriage laws, namely that sin in himself should be anticipated. In my course in the Bible, I make a great deal of the concept of the covenant. And the marriage covenant, at least the traditional marriage covenant, is a good example of what covenant is. If you want to understand the Ten Commandments or the ethics of the Old Testament, you have to understand that it is covenant ethics. It's not just kind of an objective moral code that has fallen out of the sky. In other words, the God of the Bible does not say, "Thou shalt not kill," just because it's his personal preference. The God of the Bible says, "Thou shalt not kill," because of his character. He created human beings, and he did not create human beings to be killed. He created human beings to be loved. So you have to understand the context of the Ten Commandments in a theological context. That's the reason why it's kind of a useless experiment to try to force schools and other places to just post the Ten Commandments on the board. What in the world is that going to do if there's no context for the Ten Commandments? And that has to come from someplace besides just posting them on the board. And the same thing has happened, of course, to our concept of the marriage vows. In the 60s, people started getting married, and instead of the traditional marriage vows, they said, "As long as we both shall love," by which they did not mean Christian love. They meant romantic, erotic love. Well, if you marry somebody and promise to stay with them only as long as you have an erotic thrill, then that is not a covenant. That may be a contract, but it's a very limited contract. Because if you live 50 years, then that experience or that feeling is going to ebb and flow. It might even disappear. And so that's the reason why, from the ethical perspective, you need a marriage contract. Not because you might develop the wrong attitude in the future, not because you might be a sinner in the future, but because sin in yourself is anticipated, restrained, and remedied. You get married, for instance, to a person, and the next day she's in an automobile accident, breaks her neck, has no more ability to excite you like you were excited the day before. Lots of people in America are ethical enough to still maintain their vows. But lots of people in America also assume that that is a circumstance in which they can immediately drop their vows. Let somebody else take care of her. Let somebody else do the dirty work. Well, that's the purpose for a vow. That's the purpose for a covenant, because things are going to happen. Yes?
So is it ethical, there's like I saw on TV the other day, how some people are drawing contracts up before they get married, saying this and this and this, like, we'll have sex this many times, and you clean the house, and I'll work and do all this stuff. Is that ethical? Is that Christian love?
I wouldn't say it is a very. It's obviously legal, but I wouldn't say it's a very religious or ethical way to approach marriage. It's an important way to approach marriage if we are given up on the concept of covenant. And that's usually why these prenuptial agreements are made, is because we already believe when we go into a marriage that it's probably not going to last, that is, somebody is probably not going to keep their covenant. And a prenuptial contract actually takes away the freedom of a couple to love each other the way they're supposed to love each other. But if you plan to get a divorce, it's probably better to have a prenuptial contract. In fact, I advise people, if you plan to get a divorce, if you think that is a pretty good option within the first few years of your marriage, then I wonder why in the world you're going to get married. You know, you have people on talk shows, you know, starlets who just giggle and talk about how proud they are that they don't feel the need to get married. There's nothing heroic or difficult about not getting married. That's easy. What is difficult is getting married and making a vow that you're going to remain faithful and you're going to treat this person as an infinitely valuable individual. And you're going to treat that person as an infinitely valuable individual, whether you perceive them to be that or not after a few years. I just use the health thing because that's one of the vows, in sickness and in health. And so if we don't comprehend the marriage vow as a covenant, then we're also going to have a difficult time comprehending the Constitution as a covenant. And we're going to have a difficult time understanding, say, the covenant we have between parents and children. There's an implied covenant, you know, between parents and children. The implied covenant is similar to the covenant that the Bible talks about between God and His children. That is, I'm going to unconditionally love you. I'm going to do whatever is necessary for your benefit. I'm going to protect you. Now that is a covenant. It is not even required by law. But the fact that it's not required by law sometimes leaves people with the impression that they don't have a covenant. They don't have a covenant. And so children are treated in such a way that you can't, when they grow up, you can't walk down the street. You're afraid to meet them in a dark alley. Not because they are created evil by God, but because they have not received grace and people have not lived in covenant, fulfilled their covenant to their children. And children have a covenant with their parents too. And this is all in our culture, in our history, has been theologically and ethically based. So you can't put somebody in jail in America for not taking care of your parents. You can put somebody in jail for abusing your parents. But as far as your covenant is concerned, you can turn that job over to somebody else, just like you can turn your children over to somebody else. So the idea that ethics is purely personal and subjective is totally opposite from the conception of ethics that comes from the Bible. The ethics that comes from the Bible is social. There's no purely personal law in the Ten Commandments. You have to, if you're going to take the Ten Commandments seriously, you have to personally commit yourself to this covenant. But that's not a personal ethic. The ethic, you shall not kill, that's not a personal ethic, that's a social ethic. That you should care for other people, that you should not hurt them, that's a social ethic. If there weren't any other people in the world, then there wouldn't be any need for that commandment. That commandment is a social commandment. It's a social ethic. And all of the rest of the Ten Commandments are social ethics. It's how we relate to other people. Now that means we relate to other people as individuals, we relate to other people as families, we relate to other people as communities, we relate to other people as citizens, and we relate to other people as citizens of the world. That's not an individual subjective thing. And most modern people recognize that, whether they articulate it or not, because every time China or the Soviet Union or South Africa or Guatemala or anybody, or Uganda, every time anybody anywhere in the world exploits human beings and does not allow them human rights, and sometimes even tortures them and enslaves them, Americans, even Americans who have no particular religious background, are outraged. Well, why are they outraged if this is purely a subjective thing? Well, on what basis are you outraged? Christians in America, for instance, and liberals who are liberal Christians and liberals who are not Christians, both are outraged sometimes by what, say, a Marxist or a fascist or even a Muslim country does. Like, we're outraged that they're over there bombing Buddhas. Why should we be outraged if ethics is a purely personal matter? We don't believe that. We don't believe it's a purely subjective matter. And we don't believe that because our ancestors were Jews and Christians, whether we are or not. We assume that that is an assault on humanity, that's an assault on human rights. Even though nobody gets blown up when you blow up a Buddha. And so, but what gets blown up is human dignity. And it's even more of an assault when it's actually an assault on a human person, for instance, through torture or through deprivation of rights. We get indignant about that. And I'm glad we do. But the question is, on what basis or what right do we have to be indignant when those people are operating on their own subjective ethics? We seem to think that we have a right to be indignant. We seem to think, for instance, that we have a right to say that Hitler was an evil person. What right do we have to say that if ethics are completely individualistic and subjective? Just our own preferences. Well, asserting our own preferences is a dangerous thing unless they are rooted in some way in our understanding of the nature of man and the nature of the human condition, and also our understanding of sin. That's the reason why, in a sense, the critique that a lot of people make, for instance, of the religious right in America is also right on from the perspective of Christian ethics. Because sometimes the religious right, just like all other human beings, assumes that some of its own subjective preferences are actually rooted in an ethic that should be forced on everybody else. Well, that's what ethics is an attempt to sort through things like that. You can't just go into a room assuming that all of your subjective preferences are bound on everybody in the room. But you also do not want to go into a room where nobody feels bound by any ethic. You just don't want to go there. And so that's the reason why ethics is such a complex and profound and difficult thing, because ethics is made necessary by the fall. It's made necessary by sin. If we weren't fallen, if we weren't sinners, we wouldn't need any social ethics. Social ethics is to restrain us from hurting other people, and so in that sense, it's kind of negative. You know, people say, "Well, I don't like the Ten Commandments because they're negative." That's what Ted Turner announced one time. You know, he didn't like Ten Commandments because they're negative, and he thought that maybe 2 or 3 of them could be kept, but the rest of them need to be thrown away, because what right does anybody have to say to anybody else? Well, maybe you ought to keep the vow that you made to your wife. Well, we have the freedom in America, legally, not to keep the vow that we made to our wives or to our children. But we can also see what happens to our society and our children when we don't keep those vows. So we sometimes have to have our children taken away from us in order to be protected, because we prefer not to. In taking the vow, a person acknowledges that he has not become an entirely trustworthy person. You know, remember the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting? The first thing you say is, "I am an alcoholic." When you get married, one of the first things you're saying is I cannot be counted on to be an absolutely trustworthy person. So I need to promise you something. I need to take a vow. I had a friend one time who got married about the same time I did. And he came to me a few weeks later and he said, "You know, I'm having a problem." I said, "Well, what's your problem?" He says, "Well, I still am attracted to other women, even though I'm married." His idea was, you know, he had kind of a romantic idea of marriage. That is, that there's only one person in the world for me, and I have found her, and when I marry her, then I won't have any attraction for anybody else. That is not what marriage does. Marriage is important because you will continue to have attraction for other people. And you know, it was amazing to me that I had to explain to somebody that even after he was married, he would still be attracted to women. That's not what marriage does. It's not magic. What marriage does, what marriage says is, I anticipate that there are some other good women and other attractive women in the world besides the one I married. I anticipate that. And I also anticipate that sometimes I'm going to feel like that my wife is not treating me right, and I'm not getting what I need from my wife, and so I might be tempted to overly engage some other woman. That's what the marriage vow is for. If that's not going to hinder you in the least, then you are legally and socially you're legally better off not to get married. What if the only one for you lives in Tibet? What if the only one that you could be completely and absolutely loyal to for 50 years lives in Tibet and you never meet her? That's the silliness of the romantic conception of the basis for marriage. Basis for marriage is covenant. Just like the basis for relationship to God is covenant, and the relationship of the basis of one citizen to another is covenant. There is law that backs up that covenant sometimes. That's the restraint of sin. But no law can guarantee that you're going to obey it. That's not the purpose for law. Going back to this idea, well, let's not pass any civil rights laws because you cannot enforce love. Well, that's not the purpose of civil rights laws. The purpose of civil rights laws is to recognize that you may not be a very strong keeper of the covenant. And so there needs to be some restraint. So, a marriage covenant says that I have not become an entirely trustworthy person, one on whom his prospective mate can truly rely simply on account of the momentary purity of his passion or his present single-minded sentiment. Do you understand how long your purity of passion and single-minded sentiment lasts? How many of you tried to do New Year's resolutions? Man, you feel good, don't you? Man, I'm never going to do that again. And of course, when all of our New Year's, sometimes they work if they're low enough. You know, if you make a New Year's resolution never to jump off a cliff, you can probably keep that, unless there's some very great intervening event. But if you make a New Year's resolution on most things that we consider important to make resolutions are, what we learn very quickly is that we are sinners. That is, that we are not as strong-willed and trustworthy as we like to think of ourselves. And so that's the reason why there has to be some kind of restraint that kind of enters us from the outside. In other words, why should I keep a New Year's resolution? Well, one thing that might be more compelling is if I don't keep this New Year's resolution, then my family is going to be hurt. Even if it's a New Year's resolution about something personal. For instance, I might make a New Year's resolution. If I've got diabetes, I might make a New Year's resolution to eat properly so that I don't die in the next 2 years. Well, that's not a selfish thing. It may be a selfish thing. It just may be that you're afraid to die. But it also may be an ethical thing because you'll be hurting your children, you'll be hurting your mama, you'll be hurting everybody if you don't take that seriously. And so even though you might, on occasion, fall off the wagon, you still have a kind of an ethical eschaton, or an ethical telos, that keeps you going. And you realize that it's more difficult than you thought it was. What you're realizing is, from the Jewish Christian perspective, is that you're a sinner. That's what you're realizing. He becomes trustworthy and reliable only to the degree he is able to promise. And promises should be made to people. There's no such thing as just kind of an abstract, up-in-the-air promise. It should be made to people, or to persons. You might want to make your promise to God. But a promise should be made to persons, so that if you break that promise, you understand the ethical consequences of it. In relations among men in larger groups, political democracy may be given compelling justification only if some reference be made to the problem of restraining and remedying sin. The fundamental definition of just law, which lies at the base of modern democratic theory, quite rightly takes into account the factor of sin. And then he talks about Rousseau, Rousseau's concept of the general will provides the basis for a form of association in which, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone and remain as free as before. However, in another of its aspects, the general will provides a social derivation of rights and a definition of just law which assume that man is not naturally altogether good. In other words, even if you're Rousseau, you have to have a doctrine of sin. You may not call it that. You may refer to it in some more modern jargon. But you have to have a doctrine of sin in order to provide any justification for people living together in any kind of justice. This aspect of the general will provides realistic adjustment to the fact of human sin, which if force be not back of attested justice would incline any man to take away these rights from others. I refer back to the thing that you sometimes see on bumper stickers, which is a from perspective of Christian ethics, a valid motto, or and that is, if you want peace, you should provide justice. And so, what should be coerced is justice. If you're going to coerce anything, what should be coerced is justice. The coercion of injustice, of course, is an expression of sin. Rousseau's principle for determining just law, the general will, unites subjective with objective generality, universality of will with the universality of object. It must come from all and apply to all, thus being general in its object as well as its essence. So an idealistic Christian theory of democracy comes to close grips with this problem of justifying democratic method. And it may be said pragmatically, that for the sake of the greatest total good an individual should have rights. But why should not these rights simply be given him by his rulers? That was Goebbels and Hitler's ethic, that whatever rights human beings have are rights given to them by the rulers. Why should he participate politically in securing them, unless he is in danger of not being guaranteed these more fundamental rights because of the sin of the wisest and best human ruler in the world? Mere consent does not suffice to determine the nature of political obligation. Since consent itself may be sinful, it is obliged to be right. It ought to agree only to what is just. And if being right, what is right, and being what is just is merely a subjective personal thing, then there's no basis for any kind of just society. The idea of the general will thus is framed with both justice or right and sin in mind, and it represents a way of implementing man's capacity for justice and his regard for the justly to make himself an exception. Idealistic as well as Christian democratic theory is therefore grounded in the proposition, you've probably heard this before, I made reference to it, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible. But man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. And lots of people have put this in different ways. And a lot of the sayings that we know are related to this, like power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And Churchill saying democracy is not a good form of government, it's just the best there is. And it's a necessary form of government. Right policy for political society cannot be made without some basic reference to Christian realism concerning the necessity of restraining and remedying sin. Now, obviously, it doesn't have to be in Christian language, because modern European societies generally make some reference to this, even while trying to distance themselves from Christian theology. But Christian ethics can't do that. In other words, you can't have a white paper from the president or a pronouncement from Congress that says that if Christians are going to participate in political life, they have to forget their theology and their ethics. Yes.
Thinking about right policy, a good example that just came to mind is the laws regarding children's safety and being restrained in the proper type of seatbelt restraint because
Yes.
of the lack of parents' regard for them and the deaths that arise from them.
Yeah, there is a there's a rising widespread revival in America of a kind of anarchism. That is, that interprets the Constitution as guaranteeing your right to kill yourself and other people, you know. And so there's a struggle going on about that. In fact, there's going to be an execution, may already take place by the time somebody watches this film, of a man who considers himself to be top-notch ethically, morally, and politically. And that's the man that blew up the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. He has no, he actually expresses no sense that he's done anything wrong because of his conception because of his conception of human nature. In other words, an anarchistic conception of human nature, a conception of human nature that says that the only bad guys are the government or the only bad guys are somebody else. And therefore you have the right to take justice into your own hands without any checks or without any restraint. People cannot understand why a man like that would actually consider himself to be justified. And he considers himself to be justified not just because he's crazy, he may also be crazy, but he considers himself to be justified because of his particular ethic. A great many Germans could not have been convinced of Adolf Hitler's propriety if Adolf Hitler had just got up and announced, well, I tell you what, people, from now on we're going to be executing Jews. If Adolf Hitler had got up and said that the first day he was inaugurated as chancellor, we probably he would have probably gotten rid of immediately. Because people sometimes do not understand that some of the people with the best rhetoric, the best communicators, have at their core ethics which are totally destructive of human dignity and human life. Is Christian obedient love itself a social policy? Well, what I've been trying to say is that it obviously cannot be a social policy that is immediately or even eventually fulfilled in a society, but at least any more than it can be in an individual. But at least it is out there and has been working in Western culture, and it's the basis upon which we judge sometimes the democracies of other people, the human rights records of other people, and so forth. And does the norm of Christian love in itself contain positive and definite enough social requirements for us to draw a Christian social policy directly out of this norm alone without need of searching elsewhere? Well, now that's another question. The ethics of love shows abundant content. In contrast to any form of legalism, however, the ethics of love appears to be without determinate content. always in search of a social policy, yet never completely identifiable with any current program with which it happens to make common cause. That's the problem in American history of the ethics of both the Christian right and the Christian left. An ethic of love has to have some kind of content. And sometimes this content is supplied to people, to even Christians. Sometimes this ethic is supplied by people who have no intention of being loving or being ethical. That results, for instance, in what has happened in recent years, where the Christian right is identified in the national mind with Christianity, and that is harmful to both the Christian right and to Christianity, and it's harmful to public life, because where in Christian ethics is there the absolute attachment to any one particular political party? Where in Christian ethics is there an attachment to any one particular social policy? A Christian may come to agree that right now is the time for cutting taxes, but the position that you want to cut taxes is not a Christian law. It is not a Christian requirement. This may be the time to do it because of the benefit that it might have. But it may also not be the time to do it, because if you cut taxes, you may be giving away the means or the resources that you might have to help people. So Christian ethics, this actually is what kind of determines the definition of the Christian right. Christian ethics, or the Christian left sometimes. Christian ethics cannot be identified with any one social policy just because it's in the ascendancy or just because it's politically correct. And it's very dangerous for Christians to identify, to say, for instance, that if you're really a Christian, you're going to be a Republican. Or if you're really a Christian, you're going to be a Democrat. Or if you're really a Christian, you're going to be a socialist. Or if you're really a Christian, you're going to be a laissez-faire capitalist. So, Christianity has to not only have the motivation of disinterested Christian love, obedient love, it also has to have the wisdom that comes from understanding the situation. A lot of people have been confused about what the Christian ethic is recently. Because a lot of people think that when they see somebody on the Christian left or somebody on the Christian right on TV, that they claim to be representing Christianity. Well, there's some things that the Christian right believes that does represent Christianity. There's some things that the Christian left believes that do represent Christianity. But neither one of them should be identified as Christian. But that's what a lot of people do. "42% of people who identify themselves as born-again Christians, for instance, voted for Gore." You would not know that if you watched television and media analysis of the Christian right. And a lot of people who have been involved in the Christian right for the last few decades are beginning to realize that they've actually caused a detrimental reaction to Christian ethics, and people are not welcoming of Christian comment on ethical issues, because some Christians have kind of left the impression that in order to be a Christian, for instance, you have to say hateful things about homosexuals, or you have to say hateful things about liberals, or you have to say hateful things about other people. And what they don't understand is that this is actually a conflict among Christians. It's not a conflict of Christians against non-Christians. And so some of the leaders of the Christian right have begun to realize that politics is not the handmaiden of any particular policy perspective. That Christians can very strongly disagree on how love may be affected in a political situation. So the purpose of a Christian ethicist or a Christian spokesman should not be to dictate what public policy is. It should be to try to lend at least some kind of Christian analysis, Christian motivation to public policy. But at the same time, a Christian ethicist or spokesman should understand that we live in a pluralistic society. But people on the left should also understand that because we live in a pluralistic society does not mean religious people lose their right to try to express what they consider to be Christian love in a society. In other words, Christian ethics is neither here nor there on whether anything that calls itself religious ideas are valuable, because there are some religious ideas that fall short of Christian ethics. Religious faith proves important for the growth of natural morality, not first of all because it counters the conclusions of natural reason, but because faith speaks to the problem of saving man from the sinful employment of whatever standards moral reason leads him to accept. Christian love formulates social policy by taking into account every concrete element in the situation, which determines how, in fact, some actual good may be done for the neighbor in the state of civil society and the relationships among people existing at present. One of the things that has characterized, as I say, Christian right and Christian left, a lot of Americans think that the only Christian thought is Christian right. But one of the things that's characterized the Christian right and the Christian left recently is a kind of political correctness. I tend more toward I tend to more towards sympathy to the Christian left on a number of things than I do to the Christian right. But sometimes I hear people on the Christian left making pronouncements as if God were a liberal Democrat. Just like I hear some people on the Christian right making pronouncements as if God were a conservative Republican. Well, I hate to tell you, but God is not a liberal Democrat and he's not a conservative Republican. And ethics cannot, the ethics from which you work cannot be communicated to you by political parties or by political philosophy. In other words, you're supposed to get in the mix, whether your ethics is Christian or Jewish or Buddhist or Muslim or whatever it is. You have a right to get into the mix and to try to explain to people why you believe that the nature of human being is such and that the nature of justice is such. But just identifying Christianity with any political movement or any political status quo is what has basically doomed Christian ethics to the periphery. Because when that particular political party or movement falls out of favor, then Christianity supposedly has fallen out of favor. Just like the same thing happened in science. When Christianity attached itself to Aristotelian science, when the world moved past Aristotelian science, Christianity was still connected with Aristotle's science. So people thought that in order to be a Christian, you have to believe that the world is the center of the universe. And so Christianity becomes peripheral to modern thought. And the same thing has happened in almost every aspect of the relationship of Christianity to modern thought. So Christian social ethics consists neither of intuition in search of a social policy nor of natural law possessed of a social policy. A book that I wrote, which I was going to use in this course, but then I found out that they had discontinued publishing it, was a book on Christian eschatology and ethics. And the point of the book was to try to determine a public ethic that Christianity can contribute to. And the main point of the book was that Christians have to get involved in wisdom. They can't just bring a passionate zeal to ethics. They must also get involved in wisdom and try to find out what ethics actually mean in our situation. We'll talk about some more next time.